The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals,
bestsellers,
future bestsellers,
sleep stories.
sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Hi, I'm Elvis Mitchell, film critic and host of KCRW's pop culture and entertainment show, The Treatment. Thank you all for tuning in to the 26th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, Behind the Screens, a conversation about filmmaking with Glenn Frankel, best-selling author of The Searchers, High Noon, and his latest release, Shooting Midnight Cowboy, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Mark Harris, author of Pictures of the Revolution, 5 movies and the birth of the new Hollywood. 5 Came Back, the story of Hollywood and the Second World War, and most recently, a book without numbers in the title, Mike Nichols, A Life. And Melissa Mayers, journalist, co-founder of New York Magazine's Vulture website, and author of, and I'm not going to do an impression here, All Right, All Right, All Right, an oral history of a cult classic, Dazed and Confused. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please remember to support your local independent bookstores during the festival. Signed book plates for most of these authors are available through BookSoup. Glenn, Mark, and Melissa, welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Albert.
Thank you guys. We got through the introduction. So let me say the thing I found most fascinating about these books is that they're kind of all about the exhilaration and anxieties behind collaboration. And Glenn, I'll start with you. Just seeing where John Schlesinger was at this point in his career, and the couple times I was with him, he always seemed like the most urbane person. So to see that he was often on the verge of a kind of disintegration was fascinating to me.
Well, John was a very urbane, anxious person. I mean, anxious urbanity, I'm not quite sure what the term would be. He watched every film rushes and came away saying, what are we doing here? What kind of crap are we making? And he would come in the morning and explain how upset he was to his film crew. And of course, they would put his arms around his shoulders and buck him up, and they'd get on with the day's work. The other thing he was, though, was incredibly collaborative. I mean, he attracted talented people, especially for Midnight Cowboy, where he's coming to New York for the first time, and he's taking full advantage of this whole range of fascinating figures who are there, from the costume designer to the casting director to not only the stars of the movie, but all of the supporting cast. And John, this is great for John. He loves working with talented people. He loves giving them room. At the same time, he's always the most anxious guy in the room.
I was fascinated too by the profile you kind of set up, because you make the case that he really did have an eye for young talent, finding Julie Christie as he did, and kind of turning her into something out of nothing.
Julie Christie, Alan Bates. I mean, these folks were very much people who John helped create or helped bring to fame. And, you know, Darling is Julie Christie's first starring role, and she wins the Oscar for Best Actress. So John had a feel for people. I mean, he himself had been an actor. He himself knew what it was like to be alone, if you will, and to be struggling. And he didn't work, you know, he didn't have that relationship with everyone. He always seemed to single out 1 or 2 people in a film company to pick on. But at the same time, he was just good with young talent. And you see it in Midnight Cowboy, especially with Jon Voight, for whom this is really his first movie. He's the star, he's the Midnight Cowboy, and he and John Schlesinger form a relationship during this movie, which is very creative. And which, you know, Jon Voight still talks about in the most gentle and loving of terms.
Maybe the only thing he talks about in gentle and loving terms these days, Mark, because all these books too kind of deal with these filmmakers finding young talent. And clearly you dealt with this in Pictures of Revolution, and also in this book too, the making of The Graduate, and finding this person and building a relationship. But again, that sense of collaboration. Mike kind of had to be on top all the time, didn't he?
Well, you know, one of the reasons I was really interested in writing about him is that we have this image of directors as, in some ways, our vision of the auteur is someone who wants to impose his vision for a movie on the entire cast and crew, and a vision of directors as people who sort of see actors and writers and cinematographers as potential obstacles to getting what they want. And Mike Nichols was not like that. He was an intensely collaborative director, and really was known to sort of take a suggestion from anyone, an actor, a designer, an editor. But yeah, he did have a really strong sense of what he wanted the finish line to be.
I guess the thing I was thinking about too with him is just the way that in the making of these early films, and especially The Graduate, like the stats talk about with the cinematographer realizing that, or Mike realizing that the cinematographer he idolized didn't think very much of him.
I don't think it was the cinematographer, who was Robert Surtees, who'd been shooting movies since the beginning of the sound era, at least, didn't think much of him. I think it's that he didn't think much of his bedside manner with the crew. I mean, Mike, in his early days, and The Graduate was only his second movie, could be very high-handed and abrupt and curt and even cutting on a set. And this was a story that Mike Nichols told himself, that toward the end of The Graduate, when they were trying to steal some footage on Sunset Boulevard, Mike said to Surtees, I know I've been hard on the crew, I'll apologize to them. And Surtees said to him, it's too late for that. You know, meaning the relationship had become so poisoned that there was not going to be any retrieving it. But to me, the significant thing about that story is not that Mike Nichols was so rough on the crew. It's that he told that story, and he told it to me 40 years later. And as he told it, you could see the pain and embarrassment and sort of mortification in his features. It was an awful thing to him that he had been bad to people on a set, and it was something he really spent much of the second half of his career successfully correcting.
Let's see if I can turn to you, because one of the things that comes across about Richard Linklater, Rick, is that he ends up being kind of an enigma. It's almost like everybody in the movie had a different description of him, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, Ethan Hawke, who's known him forever, says that he's kind of a mysterious guy. So I think it was hard for me to get to know him, and now I do feel like I know him a lot better. But I think, he's one of the few filmmakers that I know of who came from an athletic background, and I think he's really a good coach. And when you think about good coaches, you're going to remember from them what you want to remember from them. They bring out in you, more about yourself. They're more of a reflection of you than maybe like a major personality. And I see that in him too, that he really got people to believe in Dazed and Confused. He got them to bring a lot of their own personal lives to it, to improvise, in some cases to write their own scenes. And people really remember him really fondly from that movie because of it.
I think what's interesting too, though, is just the extent to which almost everybody in the movie fell in love with him.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to hear anybody who wants to say anything bad about him. And I think part of that is just, you think about the time period. A lot of these people were in their first big movie. McConaughey's first movie. It was Ben Affleck's first major movie. It was Parker Posey's first major movie. And here they are in Austin in this hotel, partying behind the scenes. There are people who had relationships with each other romantically behind the scenes. So all young punk rock filmmaker coming in and saying, hey, you want to write a few lines here? You want to, go and have this party at the Moon Tower that's going to be kind of feeling like a real party? Go for it. You can't help but feel good, I think, about someone who encourages you creatively and who was just there for this really good time like that.
I think what's fascinating, and I want to talk to all of you about this, and I'll start with you, Glenn, is that each of these movies, and Marcus, I get specifically in a second, but these movies are really snapshots of the era. We can definitely say about Midnight Cowboy, it became the way a lot of people thought about New York.
Definitely. It's the first of that whole parade of gritty, grimy, tougher movies about a New York that is in the process of moving from being really the capital of the world after World War II and the economic engine of America and so many things culturally. It's in the process of deterioration, and Midnight Cowboy is the first movie, I would say, to really capture that. A great cinematographer, Adam Hollander, who's new to the city. It's his first American feature film. He's from Poland. He and Schlesinger, who also comes to New York, from London. I mean, these are outsiders coming in and seeing the city and seeing this state of anxiety and disrepair, if you will, that's taking hold. And you see that all the way through the movie. The movie's many things, but these guys, both coming from a documentary background, give you a sense of exactly what the city felt like at that era.
It's interesting, too, because what he did with that, and what I really like, too, in the book is the way you juxtapose him and James Leo Hurley. I mean, these two guys kind of on the rise who basically found themselves in the making of this movie.
Yeah, I mean, they're both born roughly at the same time, 1926 and 27. Jim Hurley, he is from a working class background in Detroit, barely a high school graduate, but wants to be an artist and comes to New York City like so many young people do, comes on the Greyhound because New York is where he comes to find his future. Now, John Schlesinger is a little more accomplished by the time he gets to New York. He's already made a hit movie or two in the UK, and he's sort of flavor of the month for a while with the Hollywood studios. But he, too, is looking to prove something in New York. One of the criticisms you hear of the movie is that it's an outsider's movie. It isn't really the real New York as known to New Yorkers, but it's not meant to be. So many people come to New York to find their lives and to face their future. And that's exactly, including Joe Buck, the main character, coming from Texas, hoping to succeed in New York. And that's the spirit behind the movie, this strange, attractive, yet predatory place that they all confront when they come to town.
And Mark, for so many of the movies that Mike made, they really were these snapshots. Be it his first film, Virginia Woolf, or The Graduate, he had this kind of unerring instinct for really sort of crystallizing and reducing the culture into a movie moment.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I think it was very important to Mike to get the little details right, to sweat the small stuff, and that included for him a real sense of time and place. So, for instance, for The Graduate, he really wanted that feeling of Los Angeles new money, everything white or white and black and shiny except for the blue of the swimming pools. Like his idea of it was as much a color scheme as anything else. And when you go into his later movies, even, he had a very specific sense of the New York of the kind of hard-charging Wall Street 80s that he wanted to put forth in Working Girl, and a sense of kind of the particular segment of Washington, D.C. that was the intersection of society and politics and publishing and glamour in Heartburn, and a small town in the industrial Southwest in Silkwood. I mean, and people think of Silkwood as like the least characteristic of Mike Nichols movies, but it really is, I think, quite characteristic in terms of its attention to detail and its desire to make you believe the time and the place and the people. That was something that really mattered to him from his first movie, Virginia Woolf, which he shot parts of at Smith College, to his last.
I would say, too, as we're talking about this, the thing that he had a real affinity for was turning these big worlds into small towns. The way you were talking about Heartburn and Working Girl, and for that matter, even Los Angeles, for The Graduate, they suddenly go from being these enormous landscapes. We watch them being reduced before our very eyes, don't we?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that connects to his life experience in a way, because Mike Nichols himself got famous very young and in a very big way as a performer with Elaine May. And when he was on Broadway in 1960 and 1961 in their two-person show, he really got to meet all of the worlds of New York celebrity, publishing, fashion, photography, theater, movies, television, politics. And that world, the kind of fast-charging A-list world of New York, became legible to him in a way that allowed him to make it smaller. He got to look at it and say, okay, this is how everything connects to everything else. And this is actually a rather small pool of people, all of whom seem to know one another. And that was a feeling that he really liked to convey in his movies, this idea that he could pull viewers into a somewhat foreign world, whether it was, for instance, the drag shows of the Birdcage or the road trip campaigns of Primary Colors, and explain to viewers, like, this is a very manageable world. This has its own rules and its own hierarchies and its own population, and you're going to be able to figure it out fairly quickly, and I'm going to give you the tools to do that. He really loved doing that in movies.
Yeah, well, you can say in the Birdcage, he makes that world into something intimate and small. And the other thing he tended to do, and this fits into his kind of ethos, or rather his aesthetic, I mean to say, is he turned everything also into kind of a backstage.
Right. I mean, Mike was someone who once said, it takes me 3 hours to become Mike Nichols every day. And he was referring specifically to his wig and his eyebrows that he had to put on. But in a way, what he was also saying was that the course of a working day for him began with getting into character. And I think he thought that was true of a lot of people, that a great deal of what he was interested in filming was sort of meta performance. Like, even in Virginia Woolf, he really saw George and Martha as two people who were kind of going to spend the evening putting on a show for this young couple that they were having over for drinks. And at some point, the show was going to get out of control, out of the control of the people who were doing it, which is an experience that he and Elaine May themselves had had. The drag queen played by Nathan Lane in The Birdcage is a performer, but he's also a performer off stage. He goes through these rituals of hysteria and despair and self-mortification that everyone around him knows are kind of part of his getting into character. Nichols loved that kind of thing, and wherever he could find it and tease it out in a movie or in a character, he did it.
Also, too, the great thing about Dazed and Confused for me is that it's really kind of, as you mentioned in the book, it's kind of a snapshot of two eras. The era in which the movie takes place and the era in which the movie was shot, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting to me is that Richard Linklater wanted this originally to be an anti-nostalgia movie, a movie that shows the past was not as good as the present is. And you know what happened since then, right? I mean, this movie makes so many people nostalgic for the 70s. It makes people nostalgic for high school. Now it makes people nostalgic for the 90s. And I think that, when it came out in the 90s, it didn't feel that different from the 70s for a lot of people. You know, that first scene comes out and Aerosmith's Sweet Emotion is blasting from the car that's going around the parking lot. I saw it when I was in high school, and Aerosmith was just having this giant comeback. So that felt very much like no time had passed.
Was that the music you listened to too in high school? The music was being played in that movie as way people were saying in the movie they still listened to that music at the time?
Well, you know, some of it, I mean, Aerosmith definitely, a lot of those monsters of rock kind of bands were still on the road. But I think that Linklater was really prescient because classic rock didn't really have a comeback until later in the 90s. And I think Linklater just trusted that these songs, you didn't have to like them ironically, that they were just good songs. And I think he knew that before a lot of other people did. And then later in the 90s, you saw that becoming a much more major thing with, classic rock being on the radio. So I think he was very smart. He did it right before it was cool.
What was fascinating to me too about the book is watching, you mentioned cool, and then the kinds of things that Ben Affleck says, and watching him, we can sort of watch him in the course of the book become Ben Affleck, and the way you sculpt his responses for each chapter is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I was really kind of surprised by how important this movie is to him. He called it one of the most profound creative experiences of his life. And you think this is a guy who has an Oscar. And he said that he only has movie posters for 2 movies in his house, and one of them is Argo, and one of them is Dazed and Confused. So obviously it means a huge deal to him. I think it's funny that he kind of views himself as being not one of the popular kids when it was being filmed. It's interesting to hear from people, from women who he was flirting with, who, you know, weren't interested in him at the time. I think he kind of felt like he was viewed badly because he was playing a bully, and he played a lot of bullies around that time. So it's kind of interesting to hear him sound like kind of a vulnerable person when he talks about this movie that he still loves so much nearly 30 years later.
See, this is the thing I think that kind of unites these books too, and I'm not consciously looking for threads, but it's coming to me as we're talking about it. In each of these cases, again, these movies, and it's a whole slew of them for Mike Nichols, obviously, Mark, but these movies we're talking about, some of them specifically, like Dazed and Confused, become, as Ben Affleck says, and so many other people, even Parker Posey or a number of other actors, they talk about being spoiled by that experience.
Yeah.
Sorry, say the very last part again.
Each of these people made movies that spoiled the actors. It's very specific for Glenn and for Melissa's books, but I want to start with you on that, Melissa. It's at some point in every chapter, somebody says, wow, I thought it was going to always be like that, or I had no idea what this was. And this is actually the same thing. Go ahead.
Joey Lauren Adams said that as they were leaving, everybody thought, this is it. This is the movie that's going to make us huge. And, you know, we're never going to have to audition again. And then, you know, Dazed did not do that well at the box office. And I have a chapter in my book where I talk about how everyone went back to Hollywood or back to New York after making that movie. And people were doing Pizza Hut commercials. You know, McConaughey was doing a Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel. You know,
with Renee Zellweger
in that movie was working at Starbucks. You know, and this movie did not make people like they thought it would. And I think also because they had such a profound creative experience, because people were improvising in some cases and, you know, creating some of their own characters, that they got back to Hollywood and some of them were like, how about I change this line? And the next director would just say, no, you can't do that.
I mean, but it's fascinating to me too, because again, we're talking about these movies as being snapshots. And again, I think, and you illustrate so beautifully in the book, that Dazed had this kind of bookending mirror effect where it was capturing an era, but also I think capturing an acting style that was the beginning of a new time period in Hollywood, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, a lot of that, it's funny, you think of Dazed and Confused just being an atmospheric movie about high school where people are basically playing versions of themselves. But so many of the actors I talked to use the word method. You know, this was a time when everybody was really into Brando and James Dean, and there was a very, very much an idea that you kind of had to be that character on set. So a lot of people talked about, you know, we thought that the bullies in the movie were bullies in real life. Or, you know, we thought that Jason London, who played Pink, the popular guy, was really the one that everybody loved to hang out with. So you see a lot of kind of bleeding together of, was this person actually a mean girl, or was she just playing this role really well? It's an interesting thing at the time.
Let me start with you on this, Glenn, because the thing that is the other thing this book, not the other, lots of things I think that make these books also fascinating is that there's such a huge cast of characters. I mean, you know, we get that taste of Michael Sarrazin sort of surfacing and submerging at the beginning of the book. And talk to me about how you balance having so many people, because each chapter introduces at least 3 new characters to the cast.
Well, you know, I had no idea when I started in on this that there would be so many creative, fascinating people to write about, starting with the novelist James Leo Hurley, who's an extremely obscure figure now, and going on through Waldo Salt, the blacklisted screenwriter who, you know, redeems himself in his career through this. I mean, and on, and the great Marion Doherty, the casting director. That's not a problem, Elvis. That's a great opportunity, as we all know. I mean, to have such wonderful characters sort of at the height of their powers and all aspiring to do good work, and many of them having to prove themselves. They're all coming off sort of strange situations. John Schlesinger has just had a bomb of a movie, you know, Far From the Madding Crowd. Jerry Hellman, the producer's having a bad divorce and made a Fine Madness. You know, these are bombs, and they've got something to prove. And Dustin Hoffman and John Voight have a lot to prove too, even though Hoffman has just been involved in his very first movie, one of the counterculture iconic movies of New Hollywood. But Hoffman felt he needed to show that he wasn't Mike Nichols's, pet actor, that he actually was a great character actor who'd spent a decade in New York working on the roles and developing a process, and he needed to prove something. They all had something to prove, and I don't know. I just they all got together. It wasn't. I don't mean to paint it as just a lovely every day everybody was having a great time, because it was a difficult shoot in many ways, and the most anxious and difficult person of all was John Schlesinger, the director. But at the same time, they all kind of knew they were in something very special, and that they could bring their talents to this. Ann Roth, the wonderful costume designer who designs Joe Buck's Texas outfit and designs Ratso Rizzo. I mean, Ann Roth just got nominated for a 5th time, this time for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. I think she's the leading possibility of winning that one, Mark. I'm not sure, but these are a wonderful set of characters. They were great fun to write about. And many of them, fortunately, are still around and still think of Midnight Cowboy as one of the seminal moments in their careers.
I guess what I really want to get to with this, Glenn, is that I think you do a great job of balancing all these characters. I mean, I was just thinking about when you mentioned Waldo Salt, the time you devote to how Jennifer Salt dealt with her horrible scene in that, and how it had repercussions for her to this very day.
Yeah, but these things didn't all come at me at once. I mean, I interviewed Jennifer a couple of times, and she was wonderful to talk to. Such a smart, slightly acerbic, fun person, and a beautiful observer. But I hadn't really talked to her about herself until I got her on the phone much later. And she'd mentioned this scene in Texas, her first movie, a rape scene. And I said, how'd you like making your first movie? And she said, well, it was just fine if you don't mind being raped. And for a while we let that go, but then we came back to it, and she described exactly what had happened. I mean, we're back in the late 60s, and New Hollywood was many things, but one of the things it was a male-dominated, boys' club, and the women were there to do whatever was required. And Jennifer, being 23 years old and wanting to be a cool kid, take your clothes off? Sure, she would do that. Just trying to get along with that. It was long before the notion of choreographers of sex scenes, or that sort of thing. And so for her to, those moments were very important to me for a lot of reasons, because my book is trying to sum up not just what the movie was, but what the era was around the movie. And so how women were treated, how Marion Doherty, the wonderful casting director who doesn't even have a screen credit in Midnight Cowboy, tracing those kinds of stories down and telling them because they told me something about the era, about who was running the show, about who got left out. So, it all fits together in that way. And all the stories in there are trying to be about something that reflects the era.
I think too, yeah. But again, I think this is the thing you guys all do so well. And the reason I asked the Jennifer Salt question, I'll turn to you, Mark, is because you also do a great job of sort of dealing with Mike's attitude towards women and the way women shaped his life, and the way women had a really incredibly powerful impact on the way he comported himself, on the way he dressed himself, on the way he dealt with art.
Yeah, listening to Glenn talk about Jennifer Salt's experience, I'm remembering that I felt sort of relieved in working on the Mike Nichols book in dealing with one of the few directors of his era who, whatever else you could say about him, his sets were not toxic toward women in the way that a lot of directors' sets were at the time. It's so interesting to listen to. There are so many Mike connections to Midnight Cowboy, from Dustin Hoffman coming off The Graduate to John Voight going into Catch-22, Bob Balaban, who is the nervous kid in the theater, was someone Mike basically discovered in Plaza Suite on Broadway. Ann Roth became Mike's longtime collaborator, and his relationship with Ann Roth was very, in a way, typical of his relationship with women that he worked with. I mean, some of Mike's most important collaborators over the decades, Meryl Streep, Emma Thompson, Anne Roth, the production designer Patricia von Brandenstein, Nora Ephron and Alice Arlen on Silkwood, Carrie Fisher. I mean, he really liked working with women and was not threatened by them and didn't feel a need to dominate them and really felt that they were collaborators. And I think, to me, there's no question that all stems from the fact that his formative collaborative experience in his 20s was with Elaine May, who he thought was at least his equal, and in many ways, as a performer, his better. And I think once that imprints on you, it kind of shapes the way you're going to deal with women for the rest of your career. And you know, with Mike, you can trace it all the way down through the decades to Natalie Portman making Closer with him and saying he was the only older man who ever mentored me where there was absolutely nothing creepy about it. I mean, that is, you know, whatever the issues with Mike's temperament over the years, that's a pretty impressive legacy for a male director of his generation to leave behind.
I was thinking, as you were saying that too, about the relationships on Silkwood, which felt like a real turning point to him because he had been away from movies for a while. And this is a movie in a way that his movies had not been before. It's really built around these female characters. And his relationship with Meryl Streep, but more importantly, with Cher, for me, really informed the way that he was able to relate to women and treat them as partners. And again, as I said this, they also as collaborators rather than just employees.
I think that's true. And I do think Silkwood was absolutely the turning point for the second half of his career. Working with Streep just electrified him. I mean, he was so excited to encounter an actress who approached acting the way he approached directing, you know, as a matter of getting everything physical right and accumulating these small telling details that would enhance the lines or contradict the lines or add something to the lines. And then with Cher, who he handpicked and who was quite nervous to be in this very heady company and to be playing a lesbian and to be playing a straight up dramatic role. He was, you know, everything that she needed him to be. I mean, he was so paternal that she was calling him dad by the end of the shoot, and stern when she needed sternness and gentle when she needed gentleness. I mean, that was one of his special gifts as a director, to become the director that each performer needed him to be, even if that was a wildly different set of directors within the same production. He was one thing for Streep, he was another thing for Kurt Russell, he was another thing for Cher, and they all ended up just adoring him.
I was thinking too, Melissa, about, and I'm not going to say the title of the book again because does everybody do an impression of Matthew McConaughey when they say the title of the book?
Everyone has a better one than I have.
Better than me too, I guarantee you. But the way we got a chance to see what it was like for those female actors in the movie, and the different ages, you know, from teenagers to women in their early 20s, to Parker Posey at that point, who was a queen, who seemed to have the whole world in front of her. And then the other side, there's Michelle Burke, who's trying to figure out what her relationship is. I mean, that was getting those voices to be so specific and distinct was really something.
Yeah, you know, and the women had a much bigger role in the original script, and a lot of that got cut down. And I think that Linklater felt bad about that and ended up making Before Sunrise in part because he wanted to give a bigger voice to, you know, a female perspective. So it's interesting. It's a movie about high school that ended up being feeling kind of like high school for some of the women. You had Michelle Burke, who's playing what was originally a lead role. Some of her role got a little bit cut down. And then you had Joey Lauren Adams and Parker Posey, who thought, well, we can improvise. If our roles are small roles, let's make them bigger. Let's write our own scenes. Let's you know, figure out how to get ourselves into this movie more. And I think because they kind of saw themselves as outcasts in the movie and in real life, that there was tension between them and Michelle Burke, who was playing the popular girl. So I think in a lot of ways you see again and again throughout this movie that people felt like it was a movie about high school, that the dynamics felt a little like high school in real life.
But just hearing these women reading these women, I'm going to say hearing them talk, because I really get a sense of their voices, and that again, that's thanks to you. You really let us know that each of them sounds different from the other, and in very specific ways. But just sort of hearing how, in some cases, like Parker Posey got almost possessed by the part, and I just keep revisiting in my head that awful scene of torturing those younger girls, the freshmen, in that parking lot.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, she's amazing in that role, right? You kind of have to, like, I think somebody told me that they read the role and it was originally just kind of like Darla steps up and says, "All right, air raid." And then you see it and it's just like the camera just comes into her face and she just has so much energy yelling air raid. And, you know, I mean, you believe her in that role. You believe that she is the girl. I think a lot of people have visceral feeling of seeing that character and thinking that was the girl who was terrible to me in high school. But the interesting thing is, too, some of the girls who played the freshman girls in that movie have really positive memories of Parker Posey. Some of them remember her going to their rooms, their hotel rooms, and giving them dresses to try on. Some of them remember her taking them to the bar when they were underage and giving them cigarettes. So
Thoroughly underage.
Memories, you know, of her and how she was on set.
But again, I would just mention that again, that scene in that parking lot with the heat and all the condiments being sprayed on those female actors. That still sends a chill through me. I mean, that's both seeing that scene and acted, and also reading. I keep saying hearing because again, I keep hearing those voices from reading the book, reading the repercussions and the way those women talked about it. It's almost like PTSD for some of them.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting is that I talked to Linklater's friends from high school, and that was a real thing. A lot of people think that that's just an over-the-top thing in the movie, but actually in Huntsville, Texas, every year the senior girls put ketchup and mustard on the freshman girls, you know, cracked eggs on their heads. Some of them have really traumatic memories of going through that. And some of them I talked to when they saw Dazed and Confused in the theater years later after high school, felt like they were sad that people were laughing at that. They watched those scenes and they thought, this isn't a comedy. I went through hazing like that when I was younger, and I still feel really upset watching those scenes. So I think it's a real credit to Richard Linklater that depending on who you were in high school, you're going to find something that relates to you in the movie, but you might see it differently. You might see it as a comedy if high school was fun for you. You might see it more wistfully, or you might appreciate some of the pain in it if you didn't have as good of an experience, but it seems to speak to everyone in some way.
Let me start this question with you, Glenn, and Marco, you need a little bit of time to think about it. In working on the book and then finally getting it finished and looking at all this enormous emotional and chronological sort of expanse that you cover, did your feeling about Schlesinger and that movie get changed by the process of writing the book?
I think it did a little. Now, one thing about Schlesinger is he's not in the pantheon of new Hollywood directors. And I didn't know as much about Schlesinger as I've known over the years about Scorsese or Mike Nichols, for that matter. I learned a lot more about Mike Nichols in a wonderful way in Mark's book. The thing about Schlesinger, he makes a couple of great movies. I think Darling and I think Midnight Cowboy and certainly Sunday, Bloody Sunday are fabulous movies. And then his career begins to sputter a bit. And I never understood what that was about. The thing that I learned about Schlesinger, I think most of all, was that although he longed to be a popular entertainer, he came out of the British kitchen sink drama, black and white, gritty movie tradition, but he wasn't that kind of director. He wanted to make popular movies, but at the same time, he wanted to make movies that were true to his own vision. So Midnight Cowboy, for example, I mean, he's never expecting it to be an incredibly popular movie. I mean, nobody, including the studio that financed it and all the people involved, nobody expected it actually to make a dime's worth of profit. But he knew he had something really interesting and exciting to do. At the same time, he wasn't willing to compromise on what he felt was the honest portrait he was looking for. He wasn't willing to make Joe Buck, for example, simply a more sympathetic character. I mean, and there are moments, and there's a terrible moment toward the end of the movie where Joe Buck does something very brutal to a male gay customer of his. And a lot of people talk to Schlesinger about taking that out. Because it just would make Joe so unsympathetic, and we would lose that sense of, his vulnerability. Schlesinger insisted, and Waldo Salt, I should add, the screenwriter, insisted that that scene stay in there. And I think that's Schlesinger deciding that, well, he's going to make the movie he wants to make, and he's not going to compromise, and he's not going to make it into a bromance at the end of the day. He's going to be tougher than that, because he's not interested in the pat answers that you might get from that. He's interested in leaving you with something much more complex and less redemptive. And so that's the part of Schlesinger that's so interesting, this conflict within his own creativity as to wanting to be, to be popular in Hollywood and wanting to be successful in Hollywood. And I think he makes a number of poor choices later in his career around the idea of trying to do something that's going to work in Hollywood. But at the same time, being true to his fundamental vision of what these movies have to be about.
Mark, I guess for you, did you find your mind changed about, I guess, I don't want to ask about Nichols' career in toto, but in writing about certain movies of his, did you think, wow, this has weight or heft or something that I didn't think about before?
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. I mean, I wonder. I'll wait to see what Melissa has to say about this, but I wonder if, for all of us, the process of taking these really deep dives, whether in my case into a career or in their cases into particular movies, it is a process of coming out a little bit sadder sometimes than when you went in. I mean, for me, I guess the big thing that changed was I got really pulled into the humanness, the human scale of Mike's struggle. I think one thing that I didn't realize I was going to feel when I started the book was, for me, it became very much a book about how you deal with what comes after early success, and how, as a creative person, you refresh yourself and rebuild yourself, and deal with your own failings and your own creative failures and disappointments at every stage of your life. It's a book about being a huge success in your 20s and 30s, and then having to grapple with harder things in your 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s in Mike's case. Successes, but also big disappointments, disappointments that were completely out of your control, and disappointments where you think you could have done something better. How do you refill your tank after that? And how do you look at yourself honestly? And how do you, at every point of your life, reprioritize what you want to do and what you think will put meaning into the world? I think that was very important for Mike. And I think under all of the sort of big names and celebrity connections and famous people in my book, I think what surprised me most was how much of a story of personal struggle and private struggle it really is. And so I don't think it's a sad book, but there were points when I was working on it when I felt more sorrow about what was going on with him than I imagined that I might when I started it.
Melissa, let me ask you this then. Having gone through this, talked to all these people, a movie you saw as a kid, coming through the other side of the book, having all this material in your hands and getting into, a lot of the fascinating stuff about the movie getting made. How did you end up feeling about the movie after the book was done, after you looked at the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can watch it in so many different ways, and that's one of the best things about it. When I saw it, I was a freshman in high school, and I think it started, came out in September, so I had just started high school. And to me, even though it was set in the 70s and I was watching it in the 90s, it felt like the future. It felt like this is what the next 4 years of my life is going to be like, hopefully, in some ways, riding around with older kids and partying, and it's going to be great. And now I watch it and I see a much more wistful movie. And I see a much more painful movie. I look at the bullies and I think they're kind of kid bullies. You kind of feel sad for them. You kind of think that Ben Affleck's character, this is the best that things are going to get for him. So I do think it changes a lot over time, how you watch it. And I think it changes for the actors. Like what Mark was saying about, sustaining things over decades. When I talk to the actors, a lot of them see that movie as how do you sustain the passion of youth? That when they were in their 20s making that movie, it was about, I'm going to take this one line and think about it all night, how I'm going to deliver it. And Adam Goldberg told me, and now you're offered a role and you think, do I really want to be away from my kid on Halloween? And it becomes that, it becomes less about the passion and more about like, how do you sustain this career? So I think nostalgia is a big through line in both in the book and in the movie.
I'm going to go to some reader questions here. Start with a question from Ross. He asks, what do you find to be the most underrated or underappreciated work by John Schlesinger, Mike Nichols, and Richard Linklater?
Well, to start with Schlesinger, some of his later stuff, Cold Comfort Farm and Madame Suzetska, I'm always going to mispronounce that. There are some real gems later in his career that reflect his sensibility, even though they're not necessarily projects he himself had launched. He's a very good craftsman and an artisan. And so some of those movies are quite good. But of course, I guess Sunday Bloody Sunday, which anyone who loves John Schlesinger thinks is one of his top 2 or 3 movies, but a movie that was very overlooked in its time. It's the most intimate of Schlesinger movies. It's the one where his homosexuality, his being gay, is most reflected. His most personal movie, and in many ways, the most beautiful, intimate portrait of characters in all of his work. And though I see it as an interesting bookend of Midnight Cowboy, Midnight Cowboy is this frenetic, fascinating thing in New York. Sunday Bloody Sunday is a much quieter, calmer movie in London. But both movies reflect the cities that they depict, and at the same time are very personal and very intimate. So Sunday Bloody Sunday is one of the great movies of that era, or of any era, and I suppose that's the one I'd have to come back to.
I think that partially is too, Glenn, because that early part of his career was really about movies he was personally attached to. All these are movies that really kind of came out of him in some way or another, in a way that nothing really did after Sunday Bloody Sunday.
Yes, I think that's very true. He makes some, exciting movies after that, especially Marathon Man, which is like a horror movie in many ways, also set in New York. But you're right, the personal commitment, the joy and the exuberance and the anxiety that was John Schlesinger every day when he woke up. There's no underestimating how up and down this guy was. And yet at the same time, he was a master of what he wanted to accomplish. He knew that Midnight Cowboy had to focus on those 2 guys. He rejected a couple of screenplays early on because it didn't give him the complexity that he was looking for in the characters. So he's a complex figure, but very much it's his personal vision, and he just attracts other people to buy into it. Jerry Hellman, the producer, did not like the novel Midnight Cowboy. United Artists had rejected the novel Midnight Cowboy, and yet they were willing to take a chance to work with Schlesinger because both Jerry Hellman and David Picker, who greenlighted the film for United Artists, believed in this guy, saw the kind of work he could do, and felt that his personal commitment to this would bring it through, and they were absolutely right.
Mark, what do you think Mike Nichols' underappreciated work was?
I think his movies mostly got a fair shake, for better and for worse, from critics. But the exception, I think, is Heartburn. Heartburn's a movie I really love, and I think it's a movie that shows so many of his assets as a director, like an incredibly acute sense of a particular class and culture of people, great performances, brimming with funny little details, a real embracing of a woman's perspective. And I was really surprised when I went back and read the reviews from 1986 to see how almost universally dismissive they were, but also dismissive on the same grounds, which was why would anybody be interested in this woman's story? Why isn't it a two-sided story? Surely the Carl Bernstein character must have left this woman for a reason. Why don't we know the reason? If a man cheats on his wife, was it because she was so unattractive looking or sour? Or it was just like the idea that this film was a kind of warped perspective in that it was really only interested in the wife's point of view about why her husband cheated on her. That really kind of shocked me. And also the idea, it wasn't stated explicitly, but sometimes it almost was, that this kind of collective deflation or disappointment, this tone that sort of said, well, I guess that Mike Nichols has decided that he's just going to make these, I think Rolling Stone called them like bourgeois domestic dramas, that he was essentially going to become a woman's director, was discussed almost universally as a demotion. And it tells you, I think, a lot about where the discourse was in 1986, but maybe more importantly even, it gives the movie a rough treatment that it does not deserve. So I really recommend that people take another look at Heartburn, which I think is absolutely delightful and sharp and full of his strengths and Nora Ephron's strengths and Meryl Streep's strengths.
I think too, and you get this in the book, this is for me this kind of bookending between Silkwood and Heartburn. I mean, they're both these stories about women, and Silkwood also didn't get the kind of critical appraisal that you would have thought it would have got if you look back at that. And because, again, for me, and we've talked about this too, it begins this whole new part of his life, this way he gets to sort of recognize women and give them the kind of spotlight that he's given them in his life in this film, that these movies feel like companion pieces to me. And again, both kind of were derided in some ways when they were released.
Right, and even with Silkwood, I mean, Nichols got a Best Director Oscar nomination for it. Streep was nominated, Cher was nominated, and the reviews were largely admiring, but they were also largely bewildered in a way. They sort of said, well, I don't really get how this is a Mike Nichols movie, but it's certainly interesting. It's just not him. And I think it took him, frankly, making a few more movies for people to begin to understand how, yes, it really was him, that he wasn't just this brittle ironist who had made The Graduate and Carnal Knowledge and Catch-22 and looked at everything from a kind of frosty remove, that was only one part of his personality and only one part of his directorial approach.
Melissa, what about you? Are there movies by Rick that you think were overlooked or underrated?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about underappreciated, but definitely underseen is a movie called It's Impossible to Learn to Plow by Reading Books. A lot of people think that Slacker was Linklater's first film. It was not. This was his first feature. And it's kind of incredible. Not a lot happens in this movie. It's mostly just about him. It stars Richard Linklater, and it's him on a train ride. There's not a lot of dialogue in it. It's very impressionistic. But it was made, in the early 80s in Austin, and at a time when, Richard Linklater had worked on an oil rig and had dropped out of college and moved to Austin. He'd been rejected by UCLA's film school and University of Texas's film school. And he just decided, I'm going to teach myself how to make films. So I think you really see it in this movie. He's acting in it, he's directing it, he's doing sound in it, he's doing everything in this feature film. And I think you see a lot of how his style emerges from himself being a self-taught filmmaker rather than, starting as a PA and working his way up the ranks in Hollywood. I think I see a lot of the atmospheric qualities that you still see in Richard Linklater films today, even when he's making, a studio film.
But like in the best of his films, we can really see the rudiments of it in that movie. The best of his films are really about the passage of time, which a number of people observe in your book, that time is as much a character as anything else in the film. And so these films that really feel like they're not about anything are about the way in real time, you're experiencing yourself and the world.
Yes. And I think that goes back to this question of nostalgia that I talked about before, how he wanted to make this an anti-nostalgia movie. I mean, you literally see Marisa Ribisi's character say, the 70s obviously suck. And yet people still watch this movie thinking that, you know, it's about how great the 70s are. And I think also what's interesting is that, you know, you have this scene where Jason London is on the football field and he says, if I ever start referring to these as the best years of my life, remind me to kill myself. Again, you know, Richard Linklater warning the audience, don't be nostalgic about the 70s. And yet people are still very nostalgic about that moment in the film. You know, one of the actors told me that she saw people yelling that line at the screen at one of the anniversary parties, and she wanted to tell the audience, you missed the message. But again, I mean, you know, I asked Richard Linklater about that, and he said, you know, cinema is a nostalgia machine. You might think that it's not nostalgic to you, but it's going to be nostalgic for other people.
Here's a question from Alicia, probably end up being our last question. Any advice for a 15-year-old interested in filmmaking? Anything they could do now to become a better filmmaker? Or storyteller, I mean to say. But don't all jump and rush once to answer.
That's a really good question. I mean, when you watch films made by people who are master storytellers, and that's who we're talking about here really at the end of the day. John Schlesinger, Mike Nichols, Richard Linklater, all such different people coming from different worlds. And yet, what they share in common, I mean, they share many things, but their interest in telling stories and in using those stories to tell us a bit about what it's like to live in the world, how to survive in the world. That's the key. I think learning how to be a good storyteller, learning the elements that go into it, learning about, you know, narrative tension, learning about what characters can be used for. And it doesn't just have to be films that you could study. You can study great books, you can study journalism. There are all kinds of things I think that can help you become a better storyteller. Just sitting around the kitchen table telling stories, learning about chronology, all of that is the best way I would suggest that you can get started on this.
Anybody else want to weigh on this? We got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, I would say read a ton. You know, even if you want to be a filmmaker, not a novelist, reading stories and reading novels will absolutely help you become a better filmmaker. Reading plays, seeing plays, and I'm so happy that you used the word storyteller, because that is incredibly important, and it's really good that that's a priority for you. So I think one thing you can do is just start thinking a little bit, taking that extra minute when you read a book or when you see a movie that you really love and you feel yourself responding to it. Just take an extra minute after it's all done to think about what the movie did that made you connect with it so well. And you'll learn all kinds of things about the infinite number of ways to tell a good story or to tell a story well, just from taking that extra minute and thinking about it.
Well, I guess it's your turn now, Melissa.
Yeah, I'm in no position how to tell anyone to be a better filmmaker. I've never made a film myself. But storytelling, I definitely think, you know, just think about what you love. Like, who cares if it's a story that's going to get national attention or if a ton of people are going to, you know, watch your film or anything like that. It's got to be something that you love. I was listening to a speech by Ray Bradbury the other day, and he was saying that if you have writer's block, it's probably because you have nothing to say about the subject. And I think that's often true. And one of the things he said was, you know, make a list of all the things that make you the angriest. Make a list of all the things that make you the most passionate and make you want to like debate things with people. That's what you should be telling stories about, things that work you up.
And does Dazed and Confused still get you worked up?
Yes, you can see how I'm talking with my hands.
No, yes, I mean, I'm almost ducking from
the
you.
idea of nostalgia really works me up. I felt like I was a very anti-nostalgic person going into this book, and now I've written a book that has so much nostalgia in it. So obviously the same process that happened to Richard Linklater happened to me, but I mean, I love it. It's something I'm endlessly fascinated by.
I think, and it's just an interesting thing because these are all movies. You have a whole career you deal with, Mark, but for these movies are all movies that I feel like people react to them differently every decade. That these movies still take on a different life, and partially it does too come from the fact that some of these filmmakers, these artists, who are finding and exploring themselves in ways that I think connect with us as audiences. I think we're about out of time before I say anything else. So thank you so much to Glenn Frankel, Mark Harris, and Melissa Maris for joining us in this conversation about film and books. And thank you, viewers, for tuning into today's panel. Don't forget to check out Book Soup, where there are a limited number of signed book plates by these tremendous authors. We hope to see you all soon. Thank you all so much. Thank you, guys. You made this great and easy for me. I can still be asking you questions. I have all your books right here. Look, see? Look, books. Thank you, guys.
Elvis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.